back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. He is a commentator, analyst, specialist in military intelligence, and also he is someone who is both an American citizen and formerly lived in Gaza. And he offers a unique perspective as an insider, someone who understands the society well, someone who is also suffered heavy losses in the current conflict, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later as we discuss not only the present situation, but also looking for the day after. What can be reasonably expected in terms of Gaza after Hamas, hopefully after Hamas. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you don't mind telling us a little bit about your life growing up in Gaza and how you came to the United States.
Thanks for having me, Irina. So my name is Ahmed. I came to the United States in 2005. I was an exchange student with the State Department program. It was a post 9/11 initiative to institute cultural exchange as a way of building bridges between the Arab and Muslim world and the United States. And so the idea is to bring high school students to the United States, live with a host family for 1 year, and then go back to their respective countries. And so for me, I came to the San Francisco Bay Area. I was in the 11th grade. I was actually 15 when I came here. I'm 33 right now. But so the idea is that you live here for 1 year and then you return. I left Gaza 1 month before the withdrawal of Israeli settlements. I left in July rather, and the withdrawal took place in August. And so that was a time of immense uncertainty and anticipation as to what was going to take place after the withdrawal. There was a lot of optimism, a lot of hope, but certainly a lot of concern, because it was a kind of an unprecedented new era, if you will. And while I was in the United States here, living with a host mother who took me in as a son, and we really connected, the parliamentary elections took place in which Hamas won and had the option or the opportunity to become the majority in a new government, precipitating the kind of series of crises that led to their takeover of Gaza. And so I tried to, when I finished the program in June of 2006, I tried to go back to Gaza. I was in Egypt trying to cross into Gaza, but Hamas did the operation to abduct Gilad Shalit, and I was actually, the borders were sealed shut. There was a European police mission that operated the border, and that stopped, and there was a mini war between Hamas and Israel. And then soon after, there was the 33-day war between Israel and Hezbollah in the north in Lebanon. And so I was in Egypt for a few months, unable to return, and stuck basically. And I worked a miracle out with some friends in the United States and my US mom to return here to finish high school. And I began applying for political asylum status due to generalized threats about returning to Gaza, but also specific ones due to my participation in the program, which was heavily demonized by Hamas and others. You know, cultural exchange is a common phenomenon in a lot of countries throughout the world, but it was kind of a novel idea, this particular program, when it first started. And the program has been ongoing ever since. But yeah, it was a novel idea. And so there's a lot of kind of suspicion and demonization of the effort as an attempt to brainwash, or as an attempt to, you know, get them while they're young, is what they said. So, and ironically, when I had my asylum interview in the United States was on June 14th, 2007, which is the very day that Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, violently ejecting the Palestinian Authority and beginning their control, their absolute control over Gaza. And ultimately, I finished my education here. I have got an AA in arts, a bachelor's in business, a master's in intelligence and national security studies. I became a citizen in February 14th, no 12th, February 12th, sorry, of 2014. So that was about 10 years ago that I became a citizen. I just celebrated my 10th anniversary, and here I am. My regular, I've worked in the NGO and international development space for the last 11 years. That's my day job. But really, I put myself out there after October 7th for reasons that we'll talk about.
What was it like in Gaza before the Hamas takeover and before you just left?
It was equally challenging. I mean, nothing like it is right now, but the Palestinian Authority was there, the Israeli military was there, along with the settlements, and there were certainly lots of violent clashes and incursions and bombardment, and that was in fact kind of a part of why I was desperate to try to plant seeds outside of Gaza, because I truly felt that things were only going to sadly escalate and get worse. In 2001, there was a bombing that killed two of my friends and almost killed me, an IDF bombardment of a Palestinian police station, and I lost a significant amount of my hearing. I'm largely deaf in my left ear from that. Our family was in Gaza City, but we had family in Rafah in the south and other parts of the Gaza Strip. And I remember vividly multiple nights that we would go, or multiple times rather, that we would regularly go to Rafah, and there'd be military incursions, and it was a particularly difficult time. But I also do remember our family moved back and forth in the 90s between Saudi Arabia and Gaza, and we finally moved permanently right before the second Intifada began. And so I remember also I went to UNRWA schools because I'm descendants. We're classified as refugees. That was both how I learned quite a bit of my English, along with video games and movies, but also it was a difficult time in the sense that the schools were crowded, and yet UNRWA schools were known for having strong academic standards. And so I genuinely do mean it when I say I owe my strong English, which I then kind of ran with and took off because I knew it was going to be a tool. But I will also say, in addition to experiencing internal political instability with Hamas's gradual rise, the Second Intifada, the Israeli military occupation, the settlements, the checkpoints that we had to deal with regularly, there was also beauty. And I always make a point of talking about that. There was beauty and hope and optimism, and people adapt and they find beautiful times. I remember family barbecues. I remember kites. I'm a master kite builder. So we would fly kites both at the beach and at our home. This was before social media and smartphones, where you actually had to actually entertain yourself and find something other than staring at a screen to be able to engage others. So in the summer, when we would finish school, we'd have the 3-month summer time off. We would build kites. We would go to the beach. We would stay up late and see others, and we would have a lot of family visitations. I remember during Eid and religious holidays, Ramadan being a special time. I remember going to other friends' orchards, and they have a lot of citrus, and I remember the watermelon, and I remember just so much beauty in addition to the difficult memories. And that's also true even of Gaza after Hamas took over, because I kept in contact with my family. Of course, horrible things ongoing, and the electricity, you have generations of Gazans that only know electricity for 8 hours a day. When I left Gaza, there were roughly 1.2, 1.3 million, and Gaza's population has effectively doubled since. And sadly, I've never been back, but I have very much so kept close watch and contact with my family, with my friends, with a network of allies. that have kind of conveyed the complexity and the nuanced picture of life under the blockade, life under Hamas, but still managing to find beauty. They did and being resilient amidst all the suffering and hardships.
Were any of your family able to visit you in the US or maybe meet with you somewhere else?
Unfortunately, not to the US, but the first time I saw any of my family was in 2012. I can't or could not return to Gaza, and I don't foresee myself going to Gaza anytime soon, unfortunately. But I went to Egypt soon after the Egyptian Revolution, and one by one they came out and met me. That was a time when the borders were a little bit more negotiable and workable. And no, I have not been able to bring them out here. My mom is a retired math teacher from a government school in Gaza. My dad, who passed away 4 years ago, he was an UNRWA doctor. He actually was a senior director at the Jabalia clinic for the UNRWA. He was a physician. And I'm the black sheep in my family. I'm the only one who's not in a medical field. I pursued something else, but yeah, and a few of them have managed to get out, either in pursuit of marriage or professional opportunities, but quite a few of them are still in the Gaza Strip.
So once you finished your education here, what did you decide to do?
So I thought I would work in the tech sector. I did not necessarily connect with that. And so I went into nonprofits. I worked with homelessness and poverty with an NGO. I worked with an international development organization nonprofit that deals with global health and poverty alleviation. I also actually ran a nonprofit or started a nonprofit, small advocacy nonprofit of my own, believe it or not, to advocate the establishment of an airfield in Gaza, an IDF approved, no Hamas control, UN and internationally run airfield based on historic and contemporary precedents. The idea is the humanitarian aviation would allow for unique cargo and the movement of specialized cargo and people in and out in a way that addresses Israeli security concerns while addressing a big slice of the suffering that people in Gaza were living due to the blockade and closures from both the Israeli side and the Egyptian side, and that is the inability to move freely in and out of the Gaza Strip. And so I did that for a few years while also working in international development and nonprofits.
So what happened around October 7th? Was there anything in the air on the side of Gaza residents of your family and friends that indicated that there was a preparation for any sort of escalation?
So for me personally, I absolutely I didn't predict October 7th, but I predicted some kind of an event that Hamas would undertake to try to escape the quagmire, if you will, of governance and their inability to provide for Gaza, their financial problems. And that was twofold. Number one was I had heard from family and several contacts and friends roughly around August that Hamas was being faced with a serious financial dilemma because Qatar may cease their financial support to the group. So the Hamas government is different than Hamas's political entity, is different than Hamas's military entity. And so the idea was that Hamas's government, which is isolated internationally, that had relied on a hodgepodge of international NGOs providing for the people of Gaza, the Palestinian Authority sending in money into the Gaza Strip for specific services or purposes. But Hamas itself kind of ran its own parallel government with an estimated 50,000 civil servants. We're talking about policemen, firefighters, medical staff, and other kind of bureaucrats and administrators.
Mm-hmm.
And Hamas has always struggled to pay those people and never really fully paid them what their owed salaries, but it nevertheless relied on Qatari cash transfers that Netanyahu and himself has essentially approved and wanted to use and leverage as a way of perpetuating Hamas's control in hopes of keeping the Palestinians divided, while also thinking that he could buy stability in Gaza to focus on the West Bank issues that are relevant to his agenda, or to focus on Iran. So that was clue number one. When I got news that behind the scenes there was kind of a lot of fear on Hamas's part. I heard this in August of 2023. I knew that Hamas no longer having this, financial support, if you will, could, or at least the thought that they could lose it, and because it's an ongoing theme for Hamas is, are we gonna keep getting our money? Are we not gonna keep getting it? And then number two is there were actual protests against unemployment and the living conditions and the political conditions by Gazans in late July and early August of 2023. And so Hamas's popularity kept dipping, the people were fed up, they were tired, there were no prospects, everything was frozen. People were alive, they were sustaining themselves, but they weren't living. There's a difference between being alive and actually living your life. So that too kind of I was concerned that Hamas would attempt to do something to re-energize popularity for its program, for its MO, for its agenda, and undermine kind of the public sentiment that is critical of their continued rule. I did not expect those two things to lead to something as dramatic as October 7th, though I will never forget several years before October 7th, Ismail Haniyeh said that Hamas was building, this was years before October 7th, Hamas was building capabilities to conduct, he was vague, kind of using a combination of Arabic words between offensive and war that would forever change the Middle East. And that comment always stuck with me, and I always thought about it as I've for years have seen the consistent elevation of Hamas's military capabilities. Though, I mean, Hamas went from being a guerrilla group to somewhat of an irregular army with very clear and established and robust command structures and division of labor, and kind of that was, so I was always thinking there will eventually be something, but October 7th was nevertheless a massive surprise to me.
So, to some respect, these statements, on the one hand, we hear that, all sorts of boasting all over the Middle East about, every conflict of any kind between anybody and anybody else. You hear the boasting, we will destroy them, we will win, we will become much greater. But you're saying that there was also a consistent improvement that seemed to correspond to the statement that made it more than just the usual kind of, rhetoric.
Certainly. I mean, yes. I mean, Hamas has always sold delusions that it could, liberate all of Palestine, and I mean, a lot of that was, or that its armed resistance is capable of seriously undermining the Israeli military. Now, there's some tactical truth to that in the past, as far as, I mean, the fact that the Israeli military did not ever really fully invade Gaza until October 7th. Part of that was the concern for Hamas's capabilities and Hamas's ability to inflict damage. And there's been immense surprise among both Israeli and Western military analysts and circles by how actually considerably low the Israeli casualties have been thus far. So yes, two things are true simultaneously. Hamas boasted about its supposed invincibility and its supposed ability to inflict heavy damage upon the Israeli military. while also exaggerating its true deterrence capability to prevent the Israeli military from invading Gaza. And that was actually a big cornerstone for Hamas's popularity, or the support for Hamas, is that it was believed that the group had achieved the ability to deter Israel from entering Gaza. And that's why people supported the concept of the armed resistance, because they looked at the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority is powerless to stop the incursions of the Israeli military. So I think Hamas gravely miscalculated both the determination of Israel after October 7th to actually fully invade and essentially reoccupy significant parts of Gaza, but also the ability, the fact that Israel would apply such overwhelming force that has degraded Hamas significantly in their capabilities, even though I seriously question elements of the Israeli strategy, and I don't believe that Hamas can be fully eradicated, even if you can significantly weaken them.
So you just pointed out an important paradox that for me raises many questions, because up until this point I've read a lot of analysis about, how October 7th happened and why, wasn't anyone able to prevent it. And a lot of that, analysis included the fact that the Israelis were not, they were not paying attention to Hamas's capabilities, and they simply assumed that they could control the situation, and they basically underestimated Hamas. But what you're saying simultaneously, that at the same time there appeared to be a concern that Hamas's capabilities could be great, and there could be an incidental escalation if there were operations to take it out earlier and in a more controlled way. So I'm trying to figure out how these two things are possible, and not just on Israel's part, but also US and literally everybody else watching the area, certainly UK, certainly the European Union, everyone who designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. So the question to me is, how is this paradox of, on the one hand, underestimating and on the other hand, overestimating Hamas's capabilities, how is that reconcilable? Because I see the media analysis only tackling one part of that equation.
Certainly. No, and that is an absolutely spot on observation, in the sense that, I mean, yes, the Israeli military intelligence apparatus, the Shin Bet, and a whole element of various elements of the defense establishment were aware of the escalating capability, or the increased capability that Hamas had. I mean, obviously, Gaza is one of the most surveilled places in the world, and it was precisely this concern for Hamas's capabilities that for years the Netanyahu government, and Netanyahu himself, was overly cautious. He did not want to risk losing a lot of Israeli soldiers in an attempt to take out Hamas's capabilities. But I think the reason why, I mean, in the intelligence world, I mean, this is similar to what happened in 1973, or all classic intelligence failures are preceded by a normalcy bias. And the normalcy bias, if you will, the primary tenet, the thesis of this normalcy bias, was that no matter how much Hamas's capabilities rise and grow, kind of like Hezbollah's capabilities are triple what they were in 2006 in the last war. So no matter how much Hamas's capabilities rise, politically and strategically, Hamas is not interested in a war. Hamas is not interested in a confrontation. Hamas is not interested in losing governance of Gaza. Hamas is not interested in disrupting the status quo that allows it to be a player, that allows for this ongoing cash to come in, that allows for Gaza's redevelopment and the international NGOs. So there was a belief that Hamas is now just wanting to be a government and is desperate to be able to function effectively as a government, and that this concern for Hamas smothers the risk of the organization using its military capabilities against Israel. So, in addition to the fact that Hamas did engage in a strategic deception, long-term deception, but I would say just the main reason for why this why the failure, as you know, is the normalcy bias that set in. I mean, so in 73, for example, and I've known this before, but this was the thesis for one of my courses in grad school, for example, is the Egyptians, for example, in 1973, kind of in the year leading up to the war, to get the Israelis used to induce that normalcy bias. What they did is they started having regular weekly or monthly, then weekly, then sometimes even daily exercises of tanks and then of troops that would come up to the Suez Canal, and then the Israelis would get alarmed and they would get ready, and then the Egyptians will pull back. And so, and it became those regular exercises. They grew in size, how many units, the types of soldiers, they grew in frequency, and they just became a regular occurrence. And so after a while, okay, the soldiers along the Suez Canal, just like with Gaza, the Israeli soldiers who were in charge of monitoring the border activities kept sending those reports that were being ignored by the superiors, because some of the superiors either were invested in delivering an intelligence assessment that was consistent with the political opinion, which is that Hamas is not interested in war, or some of them just didn't believe that Hamas, like they didn't actually believe that Hamas had the ability or capability to break through the fancy fence and the technologies, and that, you know, there's just no way we can't see them coming. So it's certainly something that, you know, will be examined in depth. I mean, in tiers and depth, and I imagine there will be a detailed investigation within Israel that will reveal exactly what you just said, how why the failure to both the complexity of not preemptively taking action due to fearing Hamas's true capabilities or fearing the consequences, but also believing that Hamas is just using this for show and they're never going to actually act upon their strength, their military strength, because of the governance aspect.
So October 7th happens, much to everybody's shock, and you know, everything changes. What made you at that moment decide to start speaking out, and why weren't you? I mean, yes, you were doing the airport advocacy work, but it doesn't sound like you were politically involved in any sort of activity. And so, why did October 7th change that?
I mean, I'll be honest with you. I mean, so it was like, you know, October 6th here at night, and as soon as I saw what took place in the evening Friday night here in the San Francisco Bay Area, I knew that this was going to be a disaster of epic proportions. I knew that this was different. This is unlike anything we've experienced. I knew that Gaza as we knew it was going to cease to exist. And several threads to me came together, as far as, like I said, I had suspicions prior to October 7th that Hamas was going to undertake some kind of a dramatic action to try to escape the lack of popularity and to deal with not the chronic inability to finance its operations. And yet, to me, this came across as both, in some aspects, deviously brilliant, and in some aspects, horrendously suicidal. That this was they knew what they're doing, but they also have dragged 2.3 million Gazans along with a disastrous adventure. I saw many Gazans, in the same way that we saw those unfortunate scenes that people point out to of people celebrating the occurrence of that. And we can talk about why people, I mean, not justifying it, but actually explaining and understanding why would someone, I mean, it isn't entirely all that shocking that many would have in fact celebrated again, we're not talking right or wrong. We're talking about people that 70% of Gazans have never left Gaza. Most Gazans have never interacted with Israelis and Jews. Most Gazans only know that's, call it the brainwashing, call it the dominant narrative, call it the idea that we're in this perpetual struggle and occupation and so, and finally, this is the first of its kind battle in which, you know, the war was taking to Israeli territory or Israeli soil. That has never been done before. The idea that after all these years of blockade and all the wars, you're able to go in and capture all these people. Like, there was a spectacle to it that was absolutely unprecedented. And yes, it was mesmerizing to a lot of people. Again, we're not talking right or wrong. Nevertheless, and obviously I think it's wrong. I think it was a disaster. I think it was immoral. It was stunningly ineffective in a variety of ways we can talk about later. But I also saw hundreds of Palestinians on social media that were extremely upset by this because they knew, first of all, some of them, they knew it was going to entail a disastrous response and reaction from Israel. And some of them thought that exactly what I was thinking, which is that Hamas did this as a way to escape their failures. Others believed that we could have made different choices and options to maybe bring about something like a dramatic change, if you will, in our realities. I knew my family was going to suffer. I knew that Gaza was going to be destroyed. And so to me, there was no more, you know, I had been trying to be diplomatic in the past. I both would say things publicly that were clear, that made it clear where my position is and how I mean, my whole reason for being in the United States and being separated from my family as a teenager is largely because of Hamas. I've never had an ounce of love for these people and their political program, which I believed is a disaster. Yet I was partly concerned for my family's safety, partly concerned for the demonization of my folks. So I maybe held back a little bit, but after October 7th, I thought this is much bigger than me or my own fears or trepidations and my own family even. Furthermore, I saw the huge dehumanization of the Palestinian people and painting them as a monolithic singular group that is all Hamas, that are all bloodthirsty criminals or jihadis that just want to kill Jews. And when I know that the truth is far from that, and there's a lot more nuance, and there are a lot of people that are ideologically, politically, principally, morally opposed to Hamas, and that, you know, I was desperate to humanize the people of Gaza. And then finally, I was also alarmed by, I think, what I think was misguided activism that I genuinely thought and felt was detrimental to the Palestinian people and to the pro-Palestine movement. I believe in having a robust pro-Palestine movement, but I didn't believe that dismissing the humanity of the Israeli hostages and families or celebrating the act as a legitimate form of resistance and glorifying Hamas and overlooking how disastrous they've been to the Palestinian people, I thought that was incredibly wrong, ineffective, immoral, not strategic, and detrimental. So it was basically, I guess you want to summarize it, a desire to humanize the Gazans and to show them as a diverse group of people, just like everybody else, who were not largely not consulted or part of this horrible event, and a desire to offer sorely lacking perspectives that challenge some of the dominant narratives that proliferated right after October 7th within elements of the pro-Palestine movement and the solidarity movement.
Quite ironically, by the way, speaking of humanization, the U.S. media, even the media that was, you know, sympathetic to the Palestinians, failed to report on the very things that you're now telling me about the people on social media who were extremely concerned about the outcome of this attack and what everything would entail. None of that really made it into kind of reports about Palestinian reactions, and entirely the focus of the media was, on what happened after, and certainly on the activism in the United States and outside, and and all these voices who were basically, complaining, about Israel. None of these concerns came through. None of these narratives actually made it into mainstream discourse. And I'm wondering, in the early days of the war, were you able to get what? Well, let me rephrase it. Were you, when you tried to kind of establish the fact that this is what was happening, that not everybody was on board with this whole program, what was the reaction of the media and journalists and all these other people?
Well, I mean, that's a brilliant point, and that's why I've been talking to podcasts and alternative site, and that's why I try to build out my own voice and platform on social media to break through the dominant kind of media sphere that marginalizes a lot of these nuanced takes, because that doesn't sell, that doesn't get views, that doesn't get clicks. And I tried to paint to numerous media outlets that there's a diverse, I mean, so many people ignored the fact that just before the attack, there were these massive protests, like just like 2 or 3 months before October 7th, protests against Hamas by Gazans, just like they happened in 2019, just like they happened in 2017. So yes, there's an absolute, I think, complicit desire for these black and white narratives that not only on the part of, I think, misguided activism, but also on the part of the media reporting, due to either, I think, sadly, and with all due respect to a lot of folks, lazy journalists. Yes, they are lazy. And I've worked with enough journalists right now to tell you that is an absolute truth. And I don't mean it in like a high school, like, oh, you're lazy. I mean, actually, like, not wanting to spend the time to actually truly read source materials in Arabic, go back and do detailed dated, searches before October 7th. Believe, like, every time I would tell people I'm talking to Gazans, to people on the ground who are opposed to this, who are against this, they don't believe it. They're like, well, have them come out on camera and tell me that. And I'm like, oh yeah, so that they get a bullet to the head from Hamas, or so people fear. So like, they didn't want to believe me. They were like, some of them were like, we need receipts, Ahmed. You're claiming there are some Gazans who are opposed to Hamas. We need receipts. And it's like, I honestly, some of it, I almost thought it was like pretty prejudiced and racist to believe like, y'all are the same. Y'all believe the same thing. There could not be any diversity. It's like, okay, like to an outsider, people will look at Russia. I mean, if you look at polls, like polls in Iran or Russia, or like, why haven't the people of North Korea or Russia or Iran or Belarus been able, or Eritrea been able, or Syria been able to overthrow their dictators? Or why do we see numbers that show satisfaction with Putin or whatever? Whether or not you like Putin, that's your prerogative. I'm just saying, in a lot of these authoritarian societies, it's like easy to just paint them as all loving the Ayatollahs, or all loving Lukashenko, or all loving Putin, or all loving Assad. And I just think that's such a terrible way about to go about understanding this. Number two is I think it wasn't helped. What really, and this is part of why, again, I've been very critical, like, if there was a willingness to maybe entertain the thought that, okay, Gazans are diverse, they don't all support Hamas, regardless of the numbers and how many of them do and how many, just on principle, a lot of what we saw in the Western world and in other parts, I mean, it's Hamas's propaganda succeeded in brainwashing a lot of people in the Arab world and in the Western world. At a time when Gazans were turning against Hamas, the propaganda succeeded. And we saw those polarizing protests, and people putting the red Hamas triangles on their profiles on social media, and people having the parachutes, and people having the imagery that glorified, that break through the Israeli fence, and this unwillingness to believe that Hamas committed atrocities. And there was some reporting that, yes, some Israelis were killed by the Israeli military mistakenly or even deliberately. Some Israelis were killed by what you would call friendly fire. I think that absolutely happened, but that doesn't take away from the fact that horrendous atrocities took place, and there's an abundance of videos showing summary executions, beheadings, shooting of Thai and African migrant workers, shooting of women, attacking those people at the Nova Festival and elsewhere. Like, so unfortunately, the unwillingness to recognize the atrocities that took place by a large number of supposed, pro-Palestine activists early on. I'm not even talking after the war started and we started seeing horrible images coming out of Gaza. I think that unfortunately reinforced the perception that you have this singular pro-Palestine bloc made up of the activists, of Hamas, of the academics and whatever, and they're all just united in their hatred of Israel. They all don't care for, which is not true. I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying even within the pro-Palestine movement, there's obviously a lot of diversity, and some voices are more dominant than others. But I also will leave you with this on this point is, I find it distressing that I am one of the few, Palestinian voices in the English-speaking world that are very overtly and unequivocally clear in that, yes, I'm pro-Palestine, and I believe I want to speak out against the injustices and the crimes and the mistreatment of the Palestinian people and the occupation, but I am also vehemently anti-Hamas, anti-violence, pro-peace, pro-coexistence, anti the inflammatory rhetoric that gets us nowhere, the inflammatory feel-good activism that demonizes people and demonizes the Israelis and refuses to engage the other side and refuses to pragmatically think about a path forward beyond these maximalist slogans. So it's all connected. The media, unfortunately, saw this polarized, this unfortunate depiction of what pro-Palestine activism is, and they decided that this is it. Everybody's pro-Hamas, pro-violence. Nobody believes in peace. Nobody, and I am trying to inject some nuance into an otherwise extremely polarized scene where both sides have entrenched narratives. And make no mistake, a lot of that is true on the pro-Israel side, of course. There's a lot of entrenchment in the narratives, and whether you can call it the Hasbara and its failures, or misinformation, or even diaspora politics, the pro-Palestine folks and the pro-Israel folks outside of Israel and Palestine, in their own ways, sometimes can be even more radical and less pragmatic than Palestinians and Israelis themselves inside the land.
So this is one point I'd like to draw attention to, that nobody is really discussing at all on any side of this issue. You mentioned the economic grievances and the basic governance failures. So that, if you follow Arabic media, some of those reports have, and Israeli media, some of those reports have actually made it in, but not in the US. But what's even more shocking, that the human rights NGOs who are documenting what's going on have failed to speak out about Hamas mistreatment of Gazans on a human rights level. The fact that they've been arbitrary detentions, torture, and various violent attacks against people of different backgrounds. Starting with the Palestinian Authority political factions, but also just having general kind of horrible mistreatment of different people. Why is that? Those details of the fact that Hamas does not abide by human rights obligations towards the people it purports to govern, why has that not made it into a separate discourse even before October 7th? Why is the narrative only focused on Israel versus Hamas for whatever side, but not so much on the Palestinians in their day-to-day life? with the exception of occasional statements, Hamas is a terrorist organization, and of course they're tyrannical, you don't see a regular reporting on internal developments in Gaza.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot of nuance there as well. And I've certainly been critical of this tendency. But I think I would say why, and again, not right or wrong, but why is probably twofold. Number one is there is an overall asymmetry of power and suffering and hardships. And yes, Hamas, in my view, is a despicable organization that has held its people hostage to a horrendous, destructive agenda that has set us back by decades. And nevertheless, a lot of international folks believe that ultimately, the right or wrong, the buck stops with Israel. Israel is a powerful state with a lot of leverage and has a lot of control over the Palestinian territories and enjoys widespread Western and American support. So they feel that it is critical to focus on Israel because of the aforementioned, even though I think by doing so, they inadvertently end up neglecting Hamas's role and inadvertently end up protecting Hamas, even though that's not their intention. But ultimately, that's actually what happens. So number two is that a lot of NGOs, at least the humanitarian ones, they're in an unenviable position. And I know that because I knew a lot of them and I worked with some of them when I was pushing for the Gaza airport proposal. They are trying to operate in an area governed by Hamas. Hamas exerts a lot of administrative and bureaucratic control over these groups and has very little tolerance for anyone who basically speaks out against them. Even when UNRWA, and the New York Times reported about this, and I know this to be true, I mean, UNRWA knew that Hamas was trying to penetrate the organization with its own people or operatives or whatever. And when UNRWA would attempt to investigate that seriously, Hamas would directly and covertly put up a lot of threats and roadblocks to prevent this from taking place. My intention is not to defend a lot of these organizations. And by the way, in July and August, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, even Al Jazeera did report, Al Jazeera English, not Arabic. Arabic is unfortunately a mouthpiece for Hamas's propaganda. But Al Jazeera English reported on the protests in Gaza and they reported on Hamas's repression. But all of that seemed to have just gone to the history bin. And after October 7th, there was no willingness to weave in those diverse, threads, if you will, that Hamas unfortunately continues to hold its people hostage by refusing to, engage in pragmatic and realistic peace talks. I mean, basically, not peace talks, sorry, ceasefire talks, I meant. Hamas right now, all they're trying to do is basically go back to October 6th. There's nothing about Jerusalem that's going to happen. They're not going to get all of the Palestinian prisoners released. So that begs the question of why do October 7th in the first place? If all you want is the withdrawal of Israeli troops and tanks, okay, well, the Israelis weren't there on October 6th. The reconstruction of Gaza, okay, well, Gaza was built up. It was not destroyed on October 6th. And the surging of humanitarian aid, okay, well, people weren't famished and starving. I mean, there was a lot of hardship, indisputably so, before October 7th. I concede that. But you could have made different choices and different ideas and different decisions. But now, unfortunately, and this is the thesis of also what I have been trying to dispel, and this is what I think a lot of these NGOs are captured by. There is this mistaken belief that now is not the right time to talk about Hamas, that now is not an appropriate time to talk about their criminality, to talk about what they're doing in Gaza, to talk about their authoritarian and totalitarian rule, to talk about the oppression of women, and talk about their kind of Islamization of the society and the brainwashing of younger generations. And the summer camps and you know the just the propaganda that has poisoned the discourse and the different tiers of it, the administrative, the bureaucratic, the governing part. I mean, the fact that Hamas has abused a lot of international aid that has gone to Gaza that could have absolutely made a difference. And it is a fact that a significant amount of that, or some of it, or I'm not going to say all of it, but a significant amount was diverted to Hamas's activities instead of going to the people. There's a belief that now is not the appropriate time, a belief by pro-Palestine folks, by people who work in the NGO sector, because the scale of the destruction and the tragedy and the killing and the death by the Israeli military, including of my family member, is so awful and horrendous that nothing else trumps that. I disagree wholeheartedly. I think it is entirely, I think that Hamas and Israel's actions are inseparable. I think in a way, and I've said this openly and publicly, that Hamas and Netanyahu and the right-wing regime in Israel needed each other, and that they fed off of each other, and that you cannot criticize Israel without criticizing how Hamas has allowed elements, not all, obviously, elements within the Israeli political elite and political sphere to keep the Palestinians politically separate, to keep to weaken the Palestinian Authority and allow Hamas to get those suitcases full of cash. Hamas right now could make different decisions, like releasing the hostages, like agreeing to a long-term 5 to 10-year truce, like agreeing to allow for a new, fundamentally new government to enter Gaza. Hamas right now could make decisions to actually stop the war and improve the prospects of the Palestinian people. You have to talk about Hamas right now. There will never be an appropriate time, because there's never the right time to talk about Hamas. Before October 7th, a lot of people were like, oh, well, people are living in a blockade, or a lot of NGOs were like, oh, well, we're just trying to provide aid. We don't want to rock the boat. There will never, Hamas has made it impossible to find the right time to criticize them. So to me,
Right.
I think it is a disservice, an actual disservice to the Palestinian people, to the urgent and just aspirations of the Palestinian people, to not expose Hamas, to not show that this is an entirely avoidable war that they started. Yes, the conflict didn't start on October 7th. Duh, that goes without saying. This is an entirely avoidable war that Hamas started, that Hamas aligning itself with disgusting regional players and nefarious players like Iran and the Houthis and the Shia militias in Iraq and Hezbollah, that Hamas could have made different choices. Hamas could have embarked on a different program. And, you know, ironically, it's like Hamas sabotaged Oslo, but really now they ultimately, even though they, you know, go back and forth on the two-state solution, they ultimately just want the Oslo two-state solution. So, like, this is the tragedy of the Palestinian leadership is, you know, in 1948, after that, it's like, oh, well, we wanted to go to the 1947 partition. After 1967, you know, we wanted, to go back to the 1967 borders. And now in Gaza, after October 7th, we just want to go back to October 6th. How much longer are we going to go on like this with horrible leadership? We tried it with a pan-Arabism of Nasser. We tried it with a secular and leftist PLO and PFLP and those resistance groups. And we've been trying it for 3 decades now with the Islamism of Hamas. And yet they make the same mistakes. The more they resist, the more Palestinians get killed, the more land is lost. How much longer are we going to go on like this? So no, it is not treason. It is not, you know, people, of course, as you can imagine, attack me on both sides, but especially on the Palestinian side. And you're a Zionist bootlicker, and you traitor, and you sell out, and you this and you that. And I mean, aside from the fact that these are despicable personal attacks, I actually think it's the opposite. Like, it is precisely my love for Palestine and precisely my support for my people and my desire to save what can be saved that I want to normalize criticism of Hamas, that I want people to wake up and read the history and learn beyond the 240 characters on Twitter or the 30-second TikTok videos or the short little posts. Nobody reads books, nobody reads news, nobody reads anything. People just go off by sound bites and by videos of what's happening, which is horrible. But nobody wants to do the uncomfortable digging and to formulate the perspective or to listen to actual Palestinians. Not just myself, but there are many Palestinians who, I speak for myself, but there are many Palestinians who hold the views that I do, but either they're afraid to speak out, they're talked over, they're accused of treason either by Hamas or even these Western activists, So that's why I think, unfortunately, Hamas has been shielded and protected from overdue criticism and exposing its destructive role to the Palestinian cause and national aspirations. And it's time that gets exposed.
So ironically, Hamas has, whenever asked, has rejected the two-state solution. They keep putting out these, it's standard Islamist slogans about, getting rid of Israel completely and so forth. Obviously the Biden administration has rejected that. They said that they want Hamas gone from power. They want, they're pushing for the two-state solution, but they're pushing for the two-state solution right now. And right now, Hamas is still there. And ironically, Hamas is in Rafah, and U.S. is opposing, efforts to, get them out. And unless they're taken out militarily, I don't see why they would leave. Nobody's, they're quite comfortable surviving and trying to survive to fight another day. But the bigger question is, I am seeing several contradictory goals being pursued politically simultaneously with respect to Gaza. On the one hand, there's this need to get rid of Hamas, get the hostages released, put an end to fighting. On the other hand, there is this need to de-radicalize society ideologically, to get rid of this indoctrination and to refocus on pragmatic governance at the very least, and some sort of a coexistence. On the third hand, there's this effort to create a cohesive Palestinian nation building that so far has, which means a unified government of some sort, but and simultaneously all of these things are happening at once, and I don't really see how you can pursue all of them when some of them are contradictory. You don't want Hamas, you don't want Hamas ousted from Rafah, but you want a two-state solution, and the two-state solution with whom? Israel, on the other hand, meanwhile, is pushing for local clans and local administrators who are opposed to Hamas to take on at least some of the authorities, but that process is not being widely discussed in the United States or Europe. And the question is that a better option than all these, things that seem to be catering to the local pro-Palestinian groups and not necessarily to Gazans? Is anyone actually asking Gazans how they see a future society beyond Hamas? And what do you think is a path towards reconciling all these contradictions?
So yes, I mean, yeah, that was a whole lot you just mentioned there. And I think the challenge is that there has been a dismal failure. Now, for 2 months, the Netanyahu government has failed to come up with a cohesive, publicly articulated plan. I'm not talking about them revealing their battle plan. I'm talking about a viable, real plan like the UN and the United States and the NGOs and everybody has been saying. You cannot launch a military operation in Rafah where a million and a half have been squeezed. So that undermined Israel's own publicly stated goals. That the indecisiveness, the indecision, the lack of action, the kind of like not having a vision. I talked to people in DC involved in the behind the scenes, and they're like, the Israeli government cannot see beyond 5 days out, from where they're at right now. The priority, I think, this has to be done in phases. The idea that there's no forceful retrieval of the hostages. I think, unfortunately, it has been clear now after 5 months. I mean, basically, you've only released 2 hostages by force versus over 100 with a negotiated deal. That, and I talked to hostage families, I talked to former hostages, and I think that has to be the number one priority, is a pause or a ceasefire that allows for the release of hostages. That's number one. Number two is, while I believe that Hamas can be degraded militarily, they cannot be entirely eliminated from this scene as a component of within the Palestinian kind of political atmosphere, if you will. And those are 2 separate things. Hamas being eliminated as a government is different than Hamas being eliminated as an idea, is different than Hamas being eliminated as small cells of fighters that will carry on resistance against the Israeli military. If the Israeli military chooses to stay in Gaza, that will be a disaster for all parties, because that'll actually rejuvenate the reason for Hamas existing in the first place, which is to fight against the Israeli military occupation of the Palestinian land. The thing with the clans, I think, is incredibly short-sighted, because they are not optimized or meant to be a governing body. They're basically, yes, they hold a lot of power and sway and land and some resources and a lot of respect and capabilities in that sense, but they're not administratively, bureaucratically optimized or set up to manage resources, to manage other members of the population. And also the clans, ironically, were part of the instability internally in Gaza before Hamas's rule. And when Hamas came to power, part of their popularity rose from their ability to rein in the clans and clip their wings and crush them, because the clans had a lot of guns and they would run amok, and there were a lot of armed clashes that the Palestinian police, Palestinian Authority, were powerless to stop. So a lot of people within the Palestinian society in Gaza hold some resentment towards some of these clans from historic grievances. And this is basically a recipe, a disastrous recipe for a civil war, is if you turn those clans, even though short term, tactically, they may be able to help in some capacity when it comes to aid distribution, when it comes to protecting some convoys. I concede that absolutely short term they can help. However, Hamas has also made it clear that they don't want the clans to supplant them. They don't want the clans to take over the governance role. Hamas said that any cooperation between the clans and the Israeli military would be viewed as treason, and to basically expect those who cooperate with the Israeli military to be viewed as such. So that's why I believe that there needs to be an interim provisional alternative to Hamas that is not the clans, and that is either in the form of a mixture of Arab provisional peacekeeping force, particularly from nations that are friendly to the to Israel, or have friendly relationships with Israel, like Jordan and Egypt, and certainly the United Arab Emirates, as well as actually training a new professional force, not just a Palestinian Authority professional force, that the United States already has a role in training a lot of Palestinian Authority people that out of the embassy Jerusalem. There's a 3-star general security office that works with the Israelis and Palestinians on security coordination issue. This would be an entirely new force that is made up of vetted Gazans with a few arrivals from the West Bank. It might take a little bit of time to stand up, but this would be a professional force to help keep law and order and kind of protect and create a nucleus, an executive nucleus for a new administration in Gaza. Because again, you're going to need the bureaucracy, you're going to need the administrative arm to be able to run the medical and educational systems and just do the basic functions. You need security for incoming aid. So in that regard, yes, I think the Netanyahu and his current Israeli plans are disastrous. And also, many of the Israeli military, this establishment, they are wanting an off-ramp. They worry that the current tactical victory, if not followed up by an alternative, will be replaced by a strategic defeat. Because we're seeing in Gaza right now and in the north, where Hamas is able to reconstitute some of its forces, and that's why we see the new raid in there. The problem is that the thing about the operation in Rafah is, while I can certainly understand the desire to eliminate a significant amount of Hamas's force, it's going to be a bloodbath if it's done without what we have seen, which is no real articulated way. I mean, the hope so far has been that Israel just opens its borders and lets the Gazans in. That's not going to happen. That Egypt has built 3 layers of a border wall, basically, and created a buffer zone where it's not going to happen. Okay?
I don't know who was hoping that it would happen, because I think it was pretty obvious from anyone talking to Egypt that it wasn't. I don't know why anyone would expect it to be otherwise, by the way. That is
and to be clear, like, while I don't want Hamas to ever be a part of governing Gaza ever again. I don't say that, however, in the spirit of, well, then go into Rafah and like do this. Like, what I'm thinking is that there haven't been enough serious political, just like happened with the PLO in 1982 from Beirut, when they were given an option, when the United States and other European parties played a role in basically providing an off-ramp for some of the PLO and Arafat to leave, like providing an alternative to a massive, deadly bloodbath. And that's what I would like to see consider. Even though I'm not naive, I don't think Hamas will simply pack up and leave. But nevertheless, I think this is more consistent with the first thing that I mentioned, which is some kind of a process, this taking place as part of a negotiated deal for the release of hostages and in exchange for the Palestinian prisoners. Nevertheless, I understand the desire to finish the job and go into Rafah. I have serious questions about the actual viability of the military strategy in place. And I think I don't support, while I support getting rid of Hamas, I don't support it at any cost. If it's the cost in human life, and that's where the rest of my surviving family members are, they're sheltering in Rafah, I am not willing to accept the high human costs. And even as I want there to be a political process, coupled with a ceasefire that triggers political transformation, so that Hamas doesn't just go back to how things were before, as we've seen in all the previous wars. And just a final quick note, I mean, while I understand why people are resentful of the idea of the Biden administration and the Europeans recognizing a Palestinian state, thinking that somehow rewards terrorism, I wholeheartedly disagree with that opinion. I think actually this could be a huge motive. I mean, all wars end with a ceasefire and an agreement. I mean, peace between Egypt and Israel took 4 to 5 years after the 1973 war. So that happens after wars. Is a ceasefire follows and some kind of a negotiated settlement takes place. Even if, unfortunately, in this case, this war was started by an atrocious massacre against largely innocent Israeli civilians and in their own home and the way they were captured. So I think that this would actually inject new life into the negotiation. We saw in a poll yesterday where and I've never fully believed in these polls in the Palestinian territories, particularly in Gaza, but nevertheless, it showed increased support for the two-state solution, decreased support for armed resistance, and increased support for negotiations as a political strategy. And I think after the humanitarian suffering and the destruction in Gaza, there actually is a willingness to try something else. People are tired of war. People are tired of violence. People want something else, even if they're not verbalizing it and we hate Hamas. But that sentiment of we hate what Hamas has become to symbolize, which is a war every few years, is absolutely held by a huge number of Gazans who are turning against the group in droves. even though that sentiment is difficult to capture. So I actually hope that there can be some kind of this be used, and recognizing a Palestinian state is not recognizing the sovereignty. So it doesn't mean that all overnight the US says, okay, and UK says, we recognize Palestine, therefore they're just a state. Absolutely not. I think this could be a roadmap that quickly replaces the now ineffective Palestinian Authority with the framework of the state of Palestine, and would actually allow the Palestinians to finally focus on state building, while also not negating the need for negotiating with Israel and addressing issues around security, around the settlements, around East Jerusalem, around the incitement. And finally, I will say that, yes, I personally believe there are two things can be true at once. Unfortunately, yes, I do believe there needs to be courageous Palestinian leadership that challenges a lot of the dominant narratives within the Palestinian kind of national movement. And some of that will entail kind of introducing pragmatic and realistic ideas and options that dispense with a lot of the inflammatory rhetoric. I will also tell you for a fact that people are a product of their environment. And while brainwashing and propaganda are absolutely a problem, it is also a fact that the continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank and the injustices and the violence by the settlers and the army and the conditions in Gaza and the sense, like, yes, there are legitimate grievances that are induced by direct and deliberate Israeli policies that must also be addressed in parallel with this attempt to de-radicalize. And there has to be a better word. I don't have it yet. I'm working on coming up with that, because that word de-radicalization just carries so many notions and connotations and I want to say almost stigmas. I want to do de-radicalization without calling it de-radicalization. I want to something that's, because de-radicalization is a lot more negative and condescending, rather than I want to inspire a new thought process. I want to inspire a new narrative. And so, but for that to be successful, it has to be matched by equal action from the Israeli side that shows, guys, like, let's genuinely try something different this time. And I think it's entirely possible. I really do.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing with you, and I'm actually agree that discussing frameworks and paths to move forward are very important even at this stage. My problem is not with discussing it in principle or not in putting out this idea, but the fact that there is this sort of a unilateral, completely thoughtless push to recognize something which is really putting the carriage before the horse. And just as you are concerned about any lack of Israel's articulated vision for Rafah, this is the same issue from the other side. They're not saying what you're saying. The administration and all these other people are not talking about the process of identifying leadership and creating infrastructure, political infrastructure, not just physical infrastructure, that would support a new administration. They are not talking about how they would reunify elements of Gaza governance with Palestinian Authority, or even they're not even talking about replacing Palestinian Authority, because that would mean replacing the current leadership, and nobody's actually seems to be ready to discuss even that. So in the current form, I think the discourse is not particularly productive. Should it change to something more along the lines, I think many people would happily reconsider, but so far it seems to me kind of reactionary to domestic pressures and not really pragmatic to reality on the ground and what actually needs to happen. But I have another question, because there is another factor that is being left out of this whole discourse. Besides Israelis, Palestinians, Americans, or even other regional powers, there are other stakeholders who are intervening in the process in various ways and making it more difficult to move forward, which are players like Russia and China. As we saw today, they actually vetoed a US-led resolution over a ceasefire in exchange for hostage release, and they specifically objected to the hostage release portions. And these are two not only permanent members of the Security Council, but states that are playing an increasing role in the Middle East in general. So the question is, they clearly have anti-Western, anti-American agenda. They may care a lot less about Israel and Palestinians than about countering US, European influences and essentially insinuating their own power in the equation. And these actors are, getting in the way, and they're kind of hijacking a lot of the discourse and empowering those the very activists that are, the most problematic. So the question is how to get them out of this process to prevent them from hijacking everything once again and diverting attention from, Israeli-Palestinian dialogue to this sort of hijacking and empowering Hamas and essentially making it impossible for any sort of direct diplomacy to take place.
Certainly. By the way, I'm going to answer this, but this will be, I have a 1:30.
Yes, this is actually my last question.
Wonderful, wonderful. We'll wrap this up. Okay, and you can edit this out. I agree that there needs to be a way to bypass those obstructionist powers. I mean, unfortunately, we've seen Gaza not only be a pawn in the hands of Iran and local regional players, Iran and Qatar and Shia militias and Hezbollah and the Houthis, but now we're seeing Gaza being, Gazans being pawns in great power competition. And that is the last thing that we need right now. China and Russia do not care. I mean, I'm sorry, with all due respect, the nation that has oppressed the Uyghur people and the nation that has invaded Ukraine are not exactly in a morally reasonable position to be able to lecture the United States on the Israeli occupation. Nevertheless, I actually think it's simple to bypass them. And, this might be unpopular for some people, but I think the United States, unfortunately, has not exercised the leverage that it has and should exercise over the Israeli government. We provide the Israeli government with billions of dollars in annual support and billions recently for the offensive against Hamas in Gaza. Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, is expected to arrive to the United States in a week or two with a long list of desired weapons. And I think there can absolutely be leverage exercised over Israel to basically push on that side for a pragmatic deal while also pushing the Qataris to pressure Hamas. And it was the United States that, in a way, wanted Qatar to host Hamas after they left their location in Syria after the Syrian Revolution, because they thought this could actually help exert influence over them. So the United States should pressure Qatar, which, there are a lot of ways to pressure Qatar. We have that huge air base over there that is a kind of a central a cornerstone of stability for Qatar's national defense, if you will. So we have leverage as the United States on both parties of this war, of this conflict. And there is just either a lack of vision, or there is electoral fear, or there's a desire to not rock the boat too much in DC that is resulting in this failure and us having to be beholden to a Security Council that has been corrupted by this great power competition and the interference of players like Russia and China. So I absolutely think that the United States unilaterally can actually exercise its own leverage over the relevant players to bring about this shift and to bring about this ceasefire for the release of the hostages, knowing that while it is temporary, it can absolutely be used to build towards something more sustainable, either political transformation and an off-ramp for Israel and Hamas, or the release of all the other hostages, or the introduction of the idea of the peace force from the Arab countries or the Palestinian Authority, and certainly, and most critically right now, to prevent the famine and the hunger in the north, to surge aid to the north, to surge aid, to provide security for aid, to ensure enough aid floods the area so that it's not just all stolen or taken over by Hamas or criminals or resold to people in the black market. So there's so much that we as the United States can do that I hope today's vote and unfortunate veto in the Security Council wakes us up to realize that we need to actually act, and we control levers of powers that we have not exercised yet beyond just simple calls on Netanyahu or asking Qatar to pressure Hamas. There's a lot more that we can and should be doing.
Well, thank you so much for your insights. And one point before you leave that I want to underscore from what you said, or at least implied, is that US, Israelis, and everybody else should be currently engaging with the Palestinians who've been semi or liberated from Hamas to prevent resurgence of Hamas in those territories, and to use this time wisely to start constructive conversations, both for the sake of identifying leadership and the transition to the next day, the day after, but also to kind of prevent other actors from interfering and causing endless chaos with or without Hamas. So I do think that there is a lack of vision. I completely agree, and definitely on this part of the issue, because I'm not seeing anything about that. There's zero conversation besides media drama. And I really hope that hearing more and more from people like you, others will also be motivated to speak out and to add to the discourse. We need more nuance, not less. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone who's been watching the program. We'll be back again next week, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. On the Washington Outsider Report. Thanks and have a great